All right, let's get started. So we're still doing the categories. Really quick, do a recap of all 10 of the categories, what they are really quick, and then we'll jump back to where we actually were in the category we were on. So there's 10 categories, and remember what the categories capture. There's Aristotle saying any simple piece of language that you pick, like man, white, runs, wins, any simple piece of language that you pick can ultimately be classified into one of these 10 categories. And do we remember his system of classification, roughly what it looked like? Genus and species, genus and species, genus and species. So these are like our 10 initial genuses that we start with, and then we can start using them. You start with the genus, give some differentiating specification to define a species, and then you can use that as a genus, give some differentiating specification to define a new species, and you can keep doing that down the line all the way until you can't do it anymore. So if we were talking about substance, we might have substance, living thing, animal, man, and then cut it off right there. And then you are now a particular in there. You're no longer a classification of things. So these 10 categories are these initial genuses that we can start with in our classification of systems, is what we're listing out here, to capture all the simple language that we can talk about. So what are these 10 categories? So a thing said without any combination, meaning we're using simple pieces of language. We're not talking about combinations of pieces of language. So we're not talking about a man runs. We're just talking about man and runs. So a thing said without any combination, each signifies either substance or quantity, or qualification or quality, or a relative, or where, or when, or being in a position, or having, or doing, or being affected. To give a rough idea of each, example of substances are man and horse, of quantity, 4 foot, 5 foot, of qualification, white or grammatical, of a relative, double, half, larger, of where, in the Lyceum, in the marketplace, of when, yesterday, last year, of being in position, is lying down, is sitting, of having, has shoes on, has armor on, of doing, cutting, burning, of being affected, being cut, being burned. None of the above is said just by itself. None of the above said just by itself is any affirmation. So with none of these, we can't call them true or false. These aren't asserting some fact of the universe. It's just a classification of simple language. But by the combination of these with one another, an affirmation is produced. So now when we start stating facts of the universe, it's going to be with combinations of these types of words. For every affirmation, it seems, is either true or false. But if things said without any combination, none is either true or false. So I think we understand what that statement there is saying, because that's the rough idea of the whole categories in one sentence from Aristotle's mouth himself. Now remember, we're talking about this is a translation of Greek verbiage, so it's going to come across sounding a little funny in our English translation. And so sometimes where they have a nice, concise Greek word, we need to use a couple English words to capture that same idea. So that's why the language often sounds a little bit funny here. Okay, and we talked about what substance was, but maybe give you a rough idea of this one more time because it's the most important one. Substance can be subdivided into two types of substances, primary and secondary. What's primary substance?
The essence of...
Not the essence. What's a primary substance? Any particular individual thing in existence. This whiteboard, this marker, my shoe. Every single object you can point to, touch, feel, come into physical contact with, that is a primary essence. Aristotle's whole metaphysical outlook starts with the premise that reality is composed of these individual particular things. They are primary, so they're the primary substances. Secondary substances are ways of grouping these primary substances. These get at the essence. Marker is a secondary substance. This marker is a primary substance. I can talk about a marker, so it's a secondary substance, but I can't show you the class marker, right? I can only show you a marker, a particular thing. So every individual concrete thing in existence is a primary substance. The way that we group some primary substances into groups of substances is secondary substances. So what doesn't count as a secondary substance? White, because I can't talk about a white. Man is a secondary substance because I can talk about a man. See the difference there?
Yeah.
So primary substances, secondary substances. Secondary substances are groups of primary substances. One way to think about it. The classification here that we did from substance, we were always talking about secondary substances until we got to U. So we said substance, living thing, that's a substance. Man, animal, that's a substance. Man, that's a substance. Sorry, secondary substance, secondary substance, secondary substance. And then we got you, an actual individual person. That's primary substance. Sorry, I need to stress that a lot because that's at the heart of a lot of his metaphysics, is that distinction. Okay, so primary substance and secondary substances. Maybe remind you one more time of our predicated, not predicated, in and not in, and see how this all ties together. So we can have, I can't remember what I did on the top last time. We can have predicated of or not predicated. And we can have, sorry, can you guys see that okay? Maybe pink would do better. Is that better?
Yeah.
So predicated, not predicated, in, and then not in. And let's get an idea of each of these. So, remember what he means by in here. He means impossible to exist independent of. That's what he means by in. So running always has to be in something. I can't talk about just a running. I need to talk about a running something. So that's what we mean by in. So not in and not predicated, these are our primary substances. Individual, particular things. I can't predicate me of anything, and I am not dependent on anything for my existence. I am my own individual, particular substance, me. Okay, and then predicated, but not in, these were secondary substances. These are universals whose instances are primary substances. Horse, animal, living thing are in here. White, running are not in here.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then predicated and in. These are, I don't know how to say it, these are universals that aren't secondary substances. So these are universals, but they're in something. They're in a substance. So they're not a substance themselves. They only exist in substances. They're universals that depend on a substance for their existence. Like red. I can't talk about a red. I need a red man. So red falls into this category. Colors in this category. Actions are in this category. With me so far?
Yep.
Okay, and then this category is kind of the weirdest one to get intuition for. In but not predicated. These are particulars. I should have written this above it, sorry. Let me erase that. These are, a way to think about it, this is just intuition, not Aristotle's language, but this is non-physical particulars. This is my memory of our last class. My memory of our last class, that's a particular thing. I'm not talking about the universal memory. I'm talking about my particular memory of last class. That's not a physical thing. You can't feel, touch, taste that. You can't see that. And that memory doesn't exist independent of me. So it exists in me, but it's not a universal. So it's not something you predicate on me. It's not some universal that I happen to conform to. It's an individual, particular memory that happens to be in my head. You don't have that memory. You have your memory of last class. You don't have my memory of last class. So that one's kind of the weirdest. But, so those were the four categories, or not the four categories, but these are our four, I don't know what you want to call it, boxes. We'll just call them boxes. These are our four boxes that all 10 of these categories land in one of these boxes. So substance lands in these two boxes, and then all the other 9 categories are talking about these two boxes up here. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So I think we're pretty good on the review here. So you got primary substances and secondary substances. We talked about substance. Quantity, that one makes pretty intuitive sense. Number. Qualities, we talked about that one. Where, being a location. Maybe spend a little bit of time on where here for a second, because next we're going to talk about being in a position, and they're closely related. So where or place is position in relation to surrounding environment. So where something is its position in relation to the surrounding environment. Make sense? So when you say where am I, you say where I am relative to my environment. You might say I'm at the front of the classroom. That's where I am. So it needs to be related to my surrounding environment. When, something like yesterday or today, it's position in relation to the course of events. So earlier today is a time. Now one place that I know people often get confused with this was durations. Durations are not a time. 2 hours is not a time. That doesn't tell you when something happened. That's a quantity. 2 with the units hours. 2 hours, that's a quantity. An hour ago, time. 1 hour, quantity. See the difference there?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so that gets us back to where we are. Now, being in a position. So remember what where was. Where was your position relative to your environment. Being in a position is how an object's parts are positioned relative to the object. So you might know where I am, but you don't know how I am positioned relative to myself. Are my arms extended, or are my arms straight down? Am I lying down, or am I standing up? So knowing where my position is where. Knowing how I'm positioned relative to myself is my being in a position. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay, it's kind of a weird one. So how an object's parts are positioned relative to the object. You might know where I am, but that doesn't tell you where the parts of me are relative to my position. Example, I might be lying, sitting, standing, you don't know. Okay, next, having, being in possession of. Examples, I have knowledge of geometry, I have shoes on, I have a wife. Those would all constitute the having. And this one is probably the weirdest of all these. So if you want to read more on that one, right at the end of the organon, or of the categories, he comes back, the very last paragraph in there is having a conversation on more of this having. So kind of weird, the logical flow of the book. Handles the categories, has some side conversation, comes back at the very end to have this conversation about having. So to get a better sense of that, you can just go read the very last paragraph in there. I probably should have just put it in here to do that. But
Is it just like owning something?
having,
Yeah.
the way that we use the word having, but he gives more explanation as to why this is its own category.
Okay.
How does the specific word fit in?
Sorry, what?
Like, isn't this the category you put words in before they're compiled into things? What kind of words are going to have?
Have,
Just have. Or,
possess.
okay.
Okay, next one. The next one is when you are committing an action, and then the one after that is when an action is being committed on you. So the difference between these is, are you the one doing the action, or are you the one suffering the action? So doing or affecting is producing a change in some other object. So an actor is producing a change in some other object, but not necessarily changing the agent as well, the actor. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I might burn down the building, which in turn burns me. So it might happen to burn me as well, but that had nothing to do with my actual burning down the building. That's what he's specifying here. But not necessarily changing the agent as well. I'm the agent. I can burn the building. That might in turn burn me. So you could say, in a sense, I burn myself. But it's accidental that that happened. I could also burn the building without burning myself. So doing or affecting, and then finally being affected. Suffering a change from some other object, possibly, but not necessarily, initiated by yourself. So, I don't know. You've got some contraption where some big hammer is being held back, and there's a rope here, and I cut the rope, which releases the hammer, and it whacks me. So you can say, in a sense, I hit myself, but I just cut the rope. And that happened to lead to me hitting myself, but it was me cutting the rope. I could also cut the rope and have it not hit me. So being affected, suffering a change from some other object, possibly, but not necessarily, initiated by yourself. So I could be the one that cut the rope, or someone else could be the one that cut the rope. In either way, I suffer the effect of the hammer swings and hits me. That's how it's just that. And I think that that is it. So those were the 10 categories. So some notes about these categories. No, since the categories are the highest level of genera, they cannot be a species as well, right? They're the 10 that we start with in our system of classification. So they can't be a species, because a species requires a definition, and definition says I take my genus and my differentiating specification to define my species, right? And I can't do that because this is already the top level genus. There isn't another genus I could reference to define this genus. So since definitions define a species, this means that categories cannot be defined. I cannot define what these categories are. I can't give you a definition of it. So the only way that you can grasp these categories is strictly through intuition. I can't define them. You have to start somewhere with your words. You can't define everything. So the categories themselves cannot be defined because we don't have something higher to reference. Now someone might think, well, why can't being or everything be my top genus here? Why can't I start with being, use that as my genus to define each of my 10 categories?
Okay.
Right? So why can't being or everything be used as the highest genus, and then the 10 categories be defined with being as their genus? For Aristotle, every genus must be differentiated by some differentia that falls outside the genus. In other words, Aristotle would say a classification of everything is a classification of nothing. When you talk about a group of objects, it needs to be a group of objects relative to, it needs to be differentiating them in your classification. So when you're grouping things, there needs to be some characteristic that you're grouping by.
I assume you can't include nothing.
You can't include nothing.
Saying you can't differentiate everything compared to nothing. As
Well,
a
if
genus.
nothing is a valid concept, then it's included in everything. When we're saying everything here, we mean every concept you can conceive of. Yeah, that's what we mean by everything.
Yeah, I guess.
So if you make nothing a concrete concept, then it has to be up here, in there as well. So he says, nope, you can't do that. Your genuses need to differentiate some things from other things in order to be a valid classification to begin with, a valid genus. And then we use our genus to construct species. So this doesn't work as a genus.
So, why does there have to be so many categories? It seems like there could be technically 2 categories of each one.
There doesn't have to be 10 categories. You probably could have come up with other ways of grouping these things to combine some of these categories together. He's just doing a survey of the language and how language is used.
I see.
So, yeah, remember that when we're talking about this, the organon, it's very closely talking about language, logic, and basic facts of the universe. All 3 of those things are very closely tied together in this work. So, took a bit of thought to realize those 3 things are very different things, and obviously the first guy to do it's not going to make all those subtle distinctions. Okay, we talked about that. Oh, and similar note, we already mentioned this, but so I'm talking about this chain right here. Just as we have genera, which cannot be a species, the top categories, so too we have species that cannot be a genera, species that are not further differentiated. These lowest species are only further specified by individual instances. Note, these lowest species are how we typically use the word species today in biological taxonomy.
Okay.
And that's where they get their words. And we happen to, in the current taxonomy, call the thing right above species genus. Well, I don't know if they made more subdivisions now. They might have. But when biological taxonomy, roughly 50 years ago, I don't know if it's still the case, but roughly 50 years ago, it went genus, or it went species and genus. So that's why biology uses the words that it uses today. It's just following from this. Okay. And we already made much to do about the fact that human is a species. You can't subdivide that further into more species, which is going to be the foundation for natural rights, human rights. No human is more human than another human. Okay. So next, couple side topics that he gets into in the categories. One of them is talking about the different way that we use the word opposite. And you might remember in some of Plato's arguments, he would go something along the lines of, if an action isn't just, then it must be unjust. And if it's not unjust, then it must be just. And using this word opposite to suddenly throw it from one category to another. So it's either beautiful or it's not beautiful. It's either just or it's not just. And he'd create this dichotomy with how he would use the word opposite sometimes. And we've seen it in other arguments, where you follow the argument and it seems like it makes sense. I should have brought up an example. I don't think I put one here. It seems like it kind of makes sense what they're saying. You can kind of follow the argument, but then it seems like you're being a little wishy-washy with the way that we use this word opposite. Because sometimes an opposite of a good isn't always a bad. Or sorry, an opposite of a bad isn't always good. Let me give you an example to clear up the confusion. What's the opposite of eating way too little food?
Eating way too much.
Eating way too much food, right? And eating way too little food is bad, so eating way too much food must be good. Weird logic like that and using the word opposite weird. You see the problem there? Those types of arguments? So there's this kind of thinking sprinkled throughout Plato's works, and a lot stronger in even earlier philosophers' work. And so Aristotle's going to say, we need to get the heart of this word opposite, stop using this word opposite, and say exactly what we mean. So he's going to identify the 4 different ways that we use the word opposite. So 4 types of opposites. First off, there's relatives, and then their opposite is co-relatives. When we talk about double, the opposite of double is half. When we talk about greater, the opposite of greater is lesser. And that one, pretty good intuitive sense, right? Mm-hmm. Relatives and co-relatives. Okay. Next one is the one how it's used a lot. Contrary. Contrary statements cannot both be true. They can both be false. They cannot both be true. So contrary, all swans are white. The contrary of that is no swans are white. You with me? Mm-hmm. Now, it is perfectly possible that we live in a world where some swans are white and some swans are black. Right?
Or other color.
Well, or other color, but it doesn't matter. The point is that's an example.
Yeah.
So if we lived in a world where half our swans are white and half our swans are black, then the statement all swans are white is false, and the statement no swans are white is false. You with me?
Yeah.
So they can both be false, but notice at most one of them can be true. Because we could live in a world where all swans are white, then this one's true and this one's false. We could also live in a world where no swans are white. In that case, this one's true and this one's false. But the point is, they can both be false. That's a possibility with contrary statements.
Okay.
You with me?
Would your example be put into that category? The eating one?
Sorry, what?
Your eating example of eating too little or too much, would that be put in the contrary category?
Yes, those would be contraries of each other.
Yeah.
Not necessarily contrary statements, because didn't make those statements, but yeah, this is contrary statements. Now, when we talk about contrary words in and of themselves, those would be words like good and bad. Those are contrary words. The contrary of good is bad. Now, notice that that is not the negation. If we jump ahead in logic, what's the negation of good? Not good.
Not good, yeah.
So basically he's going to distinguish there's a difference between not good and bad. And you can't just call those the same thing.
It can't be good and bad, but it can't also not be good and bad.
Yeah, we'll see how contrary words come up, but the point is, contrary and negation, not the same thing when we're talking about particular words. So good and bad are contraries. Note that while the contrary of a good is always bad, the contrary of a bad isn't necessarily good. And we can have deficiency and excess. So these are contrary words now.
Why is the contrary good always bad?
But the reverse not.
Yeah.
So too little, just right, too much. So this is the good amount to have, this is bad, and this is bad.
Wouldn't both sides just be bad?
So notice that the contrary of good, however you say it, what's the contrary of just the right amount of food?
Anything that's
You
not
might say too little or too much is the contrary of just the right amount.
Yes.
So you might say one of these. But now when I say what's the contrary of too little, you say that's too much. When I say what's the contrary of too much, you say that's too little. Here's an example of using those words. So read what he said here again. Note that while the contrary of good is always bad, the contrary of bad isn't necessarily good. So the contrary of good gives us a bad. The contrary of the bad doesn't necessarily give us a good.
But it can, right?
What
It,
if
can,
two,
it could, yes. This is a particular instance showing that it's possible for it not to. Right?
okay.
Because you can pick particular statements where the contrary is also just the negation, basically. What's the contrary of committing adultery? Not committing adultery, right? And in that case, there's just a dichotomy between the two. But he's saying that's not always the case with how we use the words good and bad. So it can be the case where the contrary of one is, in fact, the negation of it. But that's not necessarily the case. So just because the contrary of a good is bad does not mean the contrary of a bad is good. So you can't take the contrary of the contrary and get back where you started, which is what Plato would do in some of his arguments. Okay, so that was contrary. We'll jump down to affirmation, negation, and do this one last. So affirmation and negation now, this is just talking about it the way we use it in logic. If I affirm something, the negation of that is to say not my affirmation. So if I say this marker's purple, the negation of it is this marker is not purple. The negation of black is not black. The contrary of black is white. The negation of black is not black. The negation of white is not white. Make sense? The negation of good is not good. The negation of bad is not bad. So affirmation negation. That's A and not A. He's sitting and he's not sitting. Now notice in the case of affirmation and negation, in this case alone, it is necessary always for one to be true and the other to be false. It is always the case that he's sitting or he's not sitting. One of those has to be true, one of those has to be false.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
This is only the case when we're talking about affirmations and negations. These other ones, like contrary statements, that was not the case. Later, these will be said to be contradictory. So you take an affirmation, you take its negation, those two together are a contradiction. So the statement A and not A all taken together is a contradiction because we have an affirmation and a negation, which we've already been talking about contradictions.
Yeah.
Make sense there? Go ahead.
Well, I honestly was so stuck in this contradictions, or the what's the word? Where is it? Contrary. If there was two good possibilities, one bad possibility, one.
You'd have to give a concrete example.
So if
Because Aristotle is going to argue that the good is seen as a mean between two extremes. So basically he's of the position that the good is always moderate where the bads are extremes. So you might have a dichotomy, but in the cases where you don't have a dichotomy, the good is always a moderation between two extremes, and the extremes are bad.
Well, if you were to consider more abstractly, let's say 3 paths, and 2 paths led to the same good result.
That's not going to be a contrary of one with the other. You need to come up with a concrete case where the words are agreed upon contrary to each other, and where you have two goods contrary on good contrary to good with an evil somewhere in the middle. So it's easy for us to do evil contrary with evil with a good in the middle. You'd have to come up with an example where that's not the case.
Yeah, it does conflict with the need for balance in all things, kind of.
Yeah, nature doesn't have to follow your desire for that balance.
Isn't that how he defines all of his virtues?
Yeah, so we'll see that that's one place where it comes up in his ethics. So for instance, he'll say that courage is the mean between being foolhardy and being complete coward. If you run from every danger, you're over here. If you charge into every danger, you're over here. And then if you make sound judgment about which dangers to charge into and which ones not, then you're courageous.
Yeah.
And he does that with all his virtues. He lists them out that way, with the good in between two extremes, one deficiency, one excess. So he argues for moderation in all things, relative to habits, habitual virtues. Okay, so we covered these three. Now the weirdest of these is privation and possession. One more way that we talk about the opposites. What's the opposite of being able to see?
Not being able to see.
Or being blind,
Yeah.
right? Not being able to see would be the negation. Maybe we shouldn't have done that one first, because now you'll think about it that way. But most people would probably say, what's the opposite of being able to see? Blindness. And what's the opposite of being blind? Being able to see. So that's the other usage of the word opposite that he's after here. So privation and possession. Now, blindness inside our example. Important note with privation and possession. You cannot have a privation of something you wouldn't possess by nature. I can't say, oh, this eraser is blind. No, it never had sight. So I can't call it blind. I can call you blind if you lose your sight.
What if you're born blind?
What if you're born blind? Then you can still call it blind. You cannot have privation of something you wouldn't possess by nature. When I say that you're blind, I'm saying by nature it's expected that you would have sight, and you don't. You have a privation of something we expect by nature. So the example he gives is a fetus is not blind because it shouldn't see yet. Now if you give birth to the baby and it's still blind, now we call it blind. Now it should by nature be able to see. But we don't call your fetus, right? Essentially we don't say, oh, it's blind. No, it should have never been able to see. A rock isn't blind by its very nature. Oh, we already talked about that. So privation and possession. You can't have a privation of something you never possessed.
And this is looking at something of more of a secondary nature.
Or you shouldn't by nature possess. Sorry, what?
This is looking at things of more of a secondary substance, where we're saying that something should because everything else inside that category does.
That's one way to think about it. Maybe a slightly better way to think about it is it's talking about the primary substance. The primary substance should possess it, but has a privation. It should be in the primary substance. Remember this in, the reason that he calls them in is they're dependent on primary substances for their existence.
That's right.
Yeah, so thinking about this possession, very similar to the way we like to think about the word in over here, isn't a bad way to think about it.
But it's like, for instance, so there was a genetic mutation in a baby where it never even developed eyes in the first
But
place.
by nature, human beings should have eyes at birth.
And that's why.
So that's why it's privation. So you didn't have to have it, but by nature, it's expected that you would have it.
Yes.
So if it by nature, it's expected that you would possess it, and you don't possess it, then we call it a privation.
Right.
Okay, yeah, that one's the weirdest of those four, but it is a way that people talk about opposites. So those are the four ways he identifies the word opposite being used. Any question on any of those? The most important by far are understanding these two. Contrary and then affirmation negation. We'll do a lot more of these.
I appreciate the distinction.
Yeah, who would have thought to think about all the different ways we use the word opposite?
Yeah, it is conflicting if you don't have enough ways.
Okay, slightly weirder one that he takes the time to talk about is prior. The different way that we use the word prior.
Like before?
Like before, as in prior in time. So yesterday is prior to today. Prior. Now, prior in implication of existence. One is prior to two, since two is defined in terms of one. Prior in existence. So if two exists, one must exist, necessarily. Maybe another one that, well, no, that one doesn't work. But notice that the inverse is not true in this implication. If I have 2, I for sure have 1. If I have 1, I don't for sure have 2. Okay. This one's the weirdest of them, so let's wrap our heads around this one. Prior in reciprocal implication. Okay, so if Jack is actually 6 feet tall, so there's a person, in reality, he is 6 feet tall. With me? Then the statement, Jack is 6 feet tall, is a true statement. You with me?
Yeah.
Now, Jack actually being 6 feet tall is prior to the statement, Jack is 6 feet tall.
I'm lost.
How else can I say this? The statement, Jack is 6 feet tall, is somehow dependent on Jack actually being 6 feet tall for its truthfulness.
Okay.
So the statement, Jack is 6 feet tall, is true. Sorry, Jack actually being 6 feet tall is prior to the statement, Jack is 6 feet tall being true. You with me there?
Statement
It's a little bit weird usage of prior because it's one that comes up in older philosophical texts, and people, and Aristotle's contemporaries are using the word this way. And we don't really use the word this way now, so this one feels the least natural to us. But Jack being 6 feet tall, that had to be true in order for the statement, Jack is 6 feet tall, to be true. So the truthfulness of the, so Jack actually being 6 feet tall is prior to this statement being true.
So him being 6 feet tall doesn't necessarily.
The fact of reality is prior to the statement about the fact of reality being true. But notice that the reciprocal is also true. If the statement Jack is 6 feet tall is true, then Jack is actually 6 feet tall.
Could I get another example?
It's
And not,
pick any fact about reality.
not including about statements. Is there anything outside of this, like a statement?
Not that I can come up with.
Okay.
Okay, so this one's the weirdest of them. Next one, prior in order. This was pretty simple. The introduction of a speech is prior to the conclusion. And then, last one, prior in superiority. That might sound weird, but you'll get it with this. Those things people specially value and love have priority over others. And he says that this is the least precise way that the word is used. The one that we're most focused on is, for later, is this. Prior in implication of existence. Good? This is the one we're most interested in cases where it could be confusing. I think most of the time we basically think about it like this. So it comes up like this a lot, but you don't really notice it because yesterday's prior to today, Tatty. Yesterday's prior to today is something that you don't actually stop to think about. But if you see the statement 1 is prior to 2, you might stop and think about that one. So in the cases where you'd actually have to stop and think about it, it's going to typically fall in this category. That's what I mean to say. Make sense? Okay. So that's how prior is used. Now, simultaneous. What do we mean by the word simultaneous? Those things are called simultaneous without qualification and most strictly, which come into being at the same time. So, when I flash 2 light bulbs, let's pretend we got flash cubes, so I click 2 cameras and those 2 flash cubes go off at the same time. When do I call those events simultaneous, according to Aristotle? When their flashing came into existence at the same time. Simultaneous events.
Okay.
And that's one that stands for the definition of simultaneous all the way up until Einstein. That's one of the definitions he had to redefine for us. We can also call codependent concepts simultaneous, half and double. You can't talk about half without also being a double. You can't talk about double without also making reference to half. Part and whole is another one. Try to come up with a definition of whole without somehow referencing part or something synonymous with part, or come up with a definition of part that doesn't somehow simultaneously reference something equivalent to the word whole. What does it mean to have a part of something? Well, you got the whole, no. You got the entire, no, that's the same as whole. You can't talk about part without making reference to whole. That's what it means by simultaneous or codependent concepts. Concepts that depend on each other for their understanding. And then finally, finally, there are 6 kinds of change that he talks about. The 6 ways a primary substance can change. We can have generation, destruction, increase, diminution, alteration, and then change of place. These are the 6 ways we can change an object. Now let's try and make sense of each of these changes. I take a bunch of wooden blocks and nails, and I hammer them together and I create a chair. The wooden nails, prior to my putting them together, were not a chair. I put them together in a specific way, and now we have a chair. That was generation. I created a chair. Good? Next, destruction. I take a sledgehammer to the chair. Let's not do a sledgehammer, let's keep it simpler. I now carefully come in with the hammer and carefully take out all those nails and disassemble the chair back into the initial blocks and nails that we had to begin with. That was destruction. I had a chair, I no longer have a chair. A chair was destroyed. Destruction. Good? Next, increase. That's just something getting bigger. I have my pet dog. I start feeding it a lot more. It gets bigger in size. Increase. And then the next one, basically decrease. I start starving my dog, and it starts getting smaller and smaller. Decrease. It's still a dog. I didn't destroy the dog. I didn't create a new dog. It's still the same dog. There was no generation or destruction. It was just a change of the same substance that we have. Now, maybe I should have gave a little preamble to this with talking about Heraclitus. Remember, Heraclitus says that there's no such thing as change, because all change is coming to be and passing away. It's what is becoming what is not, and what is not becoming what is. So he's saying all change is generation and destruction. Aristotle's going to say, well, now, hold on, no. Those are 2 types of changes, but there's other types of changes that don't fall in that category. And not all change is generation and destruction. Only generation is generation, only destruction is destruction. This is the only times where new substances are actually coming into or passing out of existence. With me?
Yep.
So that's why he's specifying these. So alteration, that's the most common one. I take the chair, I paint it red. That was an alteration. Still the exact same chair. Still a chair. I take you, I cut your hair. A little bit of decrease there, but also that was a change of you. You're still human. I decapitate you. Okay, now you're not a human anymore. That was destruction. You're dead.
With these changes, can they be implied with each other, like you were saying with the haircut?
Yeah. Yeah, not necessarily just one or the other.
So generation and destruction is taking something that we call something different, putting it together, and now calling it something different. And destruction is taking something and assembling back to it, or deassembling it.
Generation is cooking, destruction's eating.
Is it? I mean, that's the little. Well, we're talking about words here, right?
So generation is making an instance of one of these.
Secondary substance.
Pick a secondary substance, animal, produce an animal, that's generation.
Okay.
Destruction is getting rid of one of these.
And
Where does it go?
into something
Back into
counterparts.
its fundamental components. So maybe we can jump into metaphysics a little bit here to
Like,
help make sense of all this.
Wood and nails are secondary substances.
Yeah, a nail is a secondary substance, but you can use secondary substances to create secondary substances to create secondary substances.
Yes.
But so for Aristotle, when we talk about a concrete individual is 2 types of things. It's form and matter. So a particular human being is matter with a particular form. So matter is matter. That's, you already have good intuition for this word matter. it's the underlying substance, can't use substance, that's what we say up here. It's the underlying stuff that ultimately composes everything. Form is the form of that stuff. And there's no such thing for Aristotle as matter without form. You can't have matter without any form. Anytime you have matter, it is in some form.
So,
Even if we look at you and your most fundamental components, you're still composed of some atomic particles. And that's their particular form.
yeah, so, for instance, add paint to the chair. You still say it's a chair. Therefore,
So
it
that
cannot
was
get
one of
destroyed or
these
generated.
ones. So it has nothing to do with generation or destruction.
You might have increased, like for instance, the weight, or you might have increased
Right, so these ones right
reflective
here,
value.
this, and this change, those types of changes are always changes related to applying or disapplying these universals. Generation and destruction are the ones that make so that we can apply or stop applying these universals. So generation and destruction are completely focused on secondary substances, and then the other ones are completely focused on universals that aren't substances. Universals dependent on the in for it. That you can change an object with. And the thing being changed is always a primary substance. So primary substances are always composed of matter. The different form that that matter can have dictates what secondary substance it is.
Yeah.
So everything is just form with matter existing in a particular thing. And you'll notice once again how drastically this differs from Plato. Remember, Plato thought that the forms exist in some other dimension, the forms are out there somewhere, you can't experience them. Aristotle says, no, no, no. The form and the matter are right there in that thing. It's the form and the matter inside this marker that make me call it a marker. And once I make the matter no longer adhere to that form, I no longer call it a marker. But it will still have some form, and I'll call it by whatever form it still has. Even if I completely just break this up into protons, neutrons, and electrons, then I say it's a bunch of protons, neutrons, and electrons. This one right here is a proton, that's the form that this matter has. This one right here, that's a neutron, that's the form that this matter has, etc. So every primary substance, every one of these is some matter with some form, a particular instance, an individual thing.
Okay. How do you pronounce that? Diminution?
Diminution.
Is that literally just mean decrease?
Uh-huh. Make it smaller.
Make sure. Okay. And now the next one is just change of place. Is that just simply moving it? Okay.
Change it into place. Yep. Any other questions on any of those? Anything weird? Go ahead.
Where's the time category falling into this?
Time is a necessary condition for change.
So
Time
it's
isn't
all-
a change. Time is something that you need to experience change.
How does
So Aristotle would say, get rid of time, you get rid of change, or get rid of change, you get rid of time.
How does this counter Heraclitus' saying there's no change?
Because Heraclitus said all change is generation and destruction. It's what is becoming what is not, and what is not becoming what is.
But he's saying there's generation, destruction, and more.
Yeah, so Aristotle says, I completely disagree with you. There's this type of change, this type of change, this type of change, this type of change. You're saying all change is these two things, and I'm saying I disagree. What's this type of change? That's change that has to relate with the primary substances the way we talked about here.
Isn't that still something which wasn't becomes something which is?
What we're talking about is about how we use words. It has nothing to do with reality.
So Heraclitus would say something to the lines of, in the beginning I had a red, so I paint the chair. So let's say the chair was blue, I paint it, now it's red. So there's a change that takes place, right? So Heraclitus would say, in the beginning what you had was, you had a blue chair and not a red chair. And in the end, you had a red chair and not a blue chair. So in the beginning, the red chair was not, and the blue chair was. And in the end, the blue chair was not, and the red chair was. So you had what is becoming what is not, and what is not becoming what is. And that's how we talked about change. Aristotle says, whoa, 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 you had chair and you had chair. And you still had the same chair. We didn't destroy or generate anything.
Different universal
What happens when you build?
You had this, one of these universals, red, applying before, and it underwent an alteration to blue, blue applied before, and it underwent an alteration to red. That is not generation and destruction. That is still the one same chair. And the only way that you can stop calling it that chair is if it goes through the process of destruction, where we stop applying one of these secondary substances to it. Chair is a secondary substance. I can talk about a chair. I can't talk about a red. So he's saying, Heraclitus, you're treating red like it's a secondary substance. That doesn't work. So no, not all change is a special generation and destruction. That's a very special type of change. And there's other types of change that have nothing to do with changing this.
What about when it goes from blocks and nails to a chair?
Aristotle now agrees that was generation. So Aristotle would agree that that was generation.
You need that.
Heraclitus was trying to put all change under this one umbrella, and then at the same time he was also calling it a contradiction. You had what is not becoming what is, and what is becoming what is not. And so he threw logic out the window. Because there's change, so change applies to contradiction. There is change, so there's contradictions, so logic doesn't work. And that gives you a taste of Heraclitus' thought. If you're more interested in that, you can go back to our Heraclitus lecture.
It's purely just words. It's like we say this form of matter is a chair. We just decided it, call it a chair. And when it's no longer a chair, then it's been destroyed. When we take something that we call it wood, and we call this nails, we put it together, and then we decide to call it a chair, we just generate it. It has nothing to do with reality. It's just something
It does have to do with reality. The reason it has to do with reality, the fact that we call it a chair, yeah, that's just a word that we chose. But it does have a particular form. And the form exists in reality. We decided what to name it. But it's still a chair. The way that you know that you're making reference to something outside of your own mind is the fact that I can go get something that you've never seen before that functions as a chair and still have you correctly classify it as a chair. How did you magically know how to do that if it's just a random arbitrary convention? There was something that you observed, some pattern, some form that thing takes on, that all the other things you chose to apply the word chair to also took on. So the form does exist, and you experienced it, you witnessed it.
Yeah.
Now the fact that we call it form, that we call it chair, that's completely irrelevant. But there still are chairs in reality. Apply whatever word you want, who cares? The chairs are chairs, and that exists. So that's where you disagree with you. Keep it simpler. Don't go clear high level with a chair. Let's just talk about a line or a point. Points exist in reality. I can talk about a point. We choose the word point arbitrarily. Okay, that's completely random. We choose the word point. But points exist in reality. And I can talk about this point here, and I can talk about this point here. I can talk about lines. I can talk about triangles, squares.
So the only reason something exists in reality, whether we call it whatever, no matter what we call it, is because of the function that it performs.
No. Things in reality exist. Things in reality perform functions. We are so constituted as to be able to recognize those functions and name them.
So a chair, for instance, is something you can sit on, right? That's a function of a chair.
Sure.
If you can't sit on it, it's not a chair.
Okay.
Now,
How you choose to pick those words is completely arbitrary. That's why I said throw the chair out.
Yeah.
Pick something that has a more concrete definition that we can talk about, like a triangle. It's completely arbitrary. Why do we choose to call it a triangle?
because of its function.
Yeah, because of how it functions. We come across these things in reality, we name them, however we name is completely arbitrary, but once we name them and understand them, we can now start classifying tons of things as triangles that we've never experienced before. And it's because they have that same form.
It's a function, yeah, the form function that we understand. Sure.
The form, yes. Okay. So, a little bit of change there. Anything else on change? And how we're, see why hopefully it makes sense why he took the time to do this whole side note. That's one of the reasons why it's so great to go all the way back and see how Heraclitus threw everything into disarray and how Parmenides tried to deal with that. And you might think it's kind of arbitrary that out of the blue he decides we need to nail down change. Good? Okay. So now, just to give you a sense of Aristotle, this concludes the categories portion of the Organon. We have now covered 25 pages of Aristotle. And including last week and this week, that's like what? 3 hours, 3.5 hours of material? Now, obviously, we can't keep this pace up. And I didn't realize that I was going into this much depth until I got here and realized that I need to start summarizing a lot more. So from here on out, I'm going to start summarizing a lot more, but just get a sense of how much Aristotle wrote. We're talking about, take the Harry Potter books 1 through 5. There's his notes. We got through 25 pages. And we were still summarizing. It's dense. There's a lot in there. He did a ton. And so, keep in mind, there's zero chance of me absorbing all this information and giving you a nice coherent view of Aristotle's philosophy, because I don't know it. All right. Anyways, so that finishes the categories. The next work in the Organon is on interpretation now. I don't know if we'll need to make reference to any of that. Get rid of all these lines. On interpretation is going to be the first one focused a lot now on, well, no, this has all been focused on language. I should say that. But we'll get a little bit into his grammar now. Let's just jump into it, and then you'll see what comes up when it comes up. Language. Okay, language symbolizes mental experiences, and the written word symbolizes language. Language symbolizes mental experiences, thought processes, things that happen in your mind. Language symbolizes mental experiences, and the written word symbolizes language. While people write and speak differently, we all have the same mental experiences. So here's cat in English, here's cat in French. They say they produce the same mental experience. It's a different language, it's different writing, it's the same mental experience. So, even though some human beings speak in different languages and write in different languages, since it's the same mental experiences underlying all our language, we are able to communicate with each other and still talk about the same things. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Because it's all the same mental experiences. We all have the same experience of, we see a cat and we apply some label to it. The label we apply is completely arbitrary, but we were both talking about that thing in reality that actually exists, namely a cat.
Even though some people might have like a more in-depth experience of what.
Some people might have more or less experience with it, but the point is the word cat that we applied is completely arbitrary. And it's that thing in reality that you're talking about with that mental experience. That's what he's trying to say. Okay. So now let's get to all we're going to get into grammar-wise is just noun and verbs here. We already have good intuition for noun and verbs from our regular English, but he's not going to use it in quite the same sense that we do. So you might remember when you diagram a sentence, you typically put the subject over here, and then your predicate over here was the language you used, and maybe you have a note now of why this part of the diagram sentence is called a predicate. Once again, Aristotelian. The subject over here, though, you include your noun. Noun, so we might have man as the subject of our sentence, man as the subject of our sentence, and then we might have described him here with some adjective. The rich man, maybe, is the way that we described him. He's a rich man. So rich and man together, we would call rich an adjective for man. For Aristotle, rich man is going to be the noun. So everything you put on this side of this is what we're going to call the noun, and then the action being taken by the noun is what we're going to call the verb. Okay, so just to try and make a little distinction of, we're not talking about words exactly the way we're used to it, but still similar ideas. So now let's get to noun. Noun signifies a subject by convention, a name, but without reference to time. Now that reference to time sounds weird, but we'll make it make sense with the next one. But a noun signifies a subject by convention, a name. So cat could be a noun. And remember, convention, what's the contrary for something exists by convention? It exists by the contrary. What's the opposite of it existing by convention? It exists by going back to old philosophers. Nature versus convention. You remember the conversation? Does something exist by nature or does it exist by convention? You go back to the atomist position. Well, look right before the atomists come onto the scene. Anaxagoras was saying all the qualities actually exist in nature. Red exists in nature. Hot exists in nature. The atomists came along and they said, by convention sweet, by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold. In reality, atoms in the void. So they were saying the only thing that exists by nature is atoms in the void. Everything else we talk about in reality is just convention.
That's right.
The common one that the sophists argue for is that justice exists by convention. Justice is just a social construct. Socrates starts out with, well, they were saying that about morality in general. When Socrates comes onto the scene, one of the things he's fighting for is no. There's an objective and absolute metric to determine whether something is right or wrong, moral or immoral. It exists by nature. It's not just a convention. So we've been talking about this dichotomy between convention and nature for a long time now, and what exists by convention and what exists by nature. So that's why he's using this language. So the mental experience, that's something in nature in and of itself. The name we apply to it, that exists by convention. So the words exist by conventions, but the things themselves exist in nature. So noun signifies a subject by convention, a name, but without reference to time. Now let's make this without reference to time make sense. If I were to talk about health, that's noun. I could talk about the health of a man. If I said was healthy, and I add some, what's it called? Not adverb. What do we call that? I just lost the word. Its position in time is its tense. When we apply a tense to a verb, its position in time, or when we apply tense to a noun, we turn it into a verb. We make it somehow time dependent. So health has nothing to do with time, but was healthy, which is now a verb, does take time into consideration. That's what he means by without reference to time. So verb. Verb is a sign of something said of a subject. Verb is a sign of something said of a subject. Like I naturally want to say sign is something said of a subject. Or verb is something said of a subject. Verb is a sign of something said of a subject. Maybe we're just talking about the letters here. The actual word is a verb. So the words, notice it can be more than one for how he uses verb, like was healthy is a verb over here. So verb is a sign of something said of the subject, so it's what's said of the subject. So when we diagram our sentence, we had our subject on the left, and then what is said of the subject on the right, the verb on the right. It carries with it the notion of time, typically in the tense of the verb, with an untensed verb indicating present. So the man runs, well, I don't know. I don't know if it comes out that same way in English. Because we want to say is running. Anyways, notice that the verbs, though, do make reference to time. What's another example? Huh?
Sit, did sit.
But I'm trying to think of one that could be a noun. Quick. So, quickness, typically we say quickness. Quickness could be a noun. You could talk about quickness, say things about quickness, the noun. And then you could add a time dependent to it. The man was, that's still not what I was going for, was quick. Would still be a verb with how Aristotle uses it. Anyways, the verb is what's said of the subject. The noun is the subject. And notice that the noun can include what we typically call a noun and the adjective. Okay, while nouns and verbs are significant, they do not by themselves signify a fact or judgment. We cannot call them true or false. So So I can't call a noun by itself true or false, and I can't call a verb by itself true or false. But notice that when I put them together, or many of the statements that I do call true or false is putting them together. So I can't say the man is true or false, and I can't say was running is true or false. But if I take the man was running, now I can call that thing true or false. The man being the noun, was running being the verb, with how Aristotle is using the language here.
So how can you have a noun and a verb and not make it a statement? True or false?
The man shooting over, I don't know,
Oh, gotcha.
try and just make some nonsense that includes a noun and a verb. So it might be nonsense, but if it makes sense and you put together a noun and a verb, you're going to have something that you can call true or false, an affirmation. All right, so now what's a sentence? A significant portion of speech, some parts of which have an independent meaning, the noun and the verb, whose meaning is established by convention. Okay, a significant portion of speech, so it has to signify something, some parts of which have an independent meaning, the noun and the verb. So notice the man has meaning. You comprehend the words the man, that means something. It's just not something that you can yet call true or false. And was running still has meaning. It's still conveying something, but you still can't call it true or false. And the meaning of those words are established by convention. It's not, language doesn't exist in nature. So now we finally get to a proposition. Proposition, something that is either true or false, not both. One or the other, and only one or the other. That's a proposition. Important to distinguish between proposition and sentence. We can encode a proposition in a sentence. But a proposition and a sentence are not the same thing. So, I can say, this marker is green. That's a sentence which encodes a proposition. This marker is green. Notice you can call that true or false, right? And I can encode that in the English sentence, this marker is green. I could also say this marker is green in French. That's a different sentence now. But it's still the same proposition.
Okay.
So the proposition is what is being stated, and then whether I use English words to state it or French words to state it makes no difference. So the proposition would be, in some sense, the form of the sentence, and the matter of the sentence would be the actual language you use to convey that message. That make sense? So we can use sentences to encode propositions, but a proposition is not a sentence. Proposition is the thing actually being said. The sentence is the words saying it. Kind of subtle until you just get it, then it might feel like I'm repeating myself. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Okay. So while not all sentences are propositions, there is such thing as commands or questions, sentences are capable of expressing propositions or encoding propositions. John is 18 years old. So now we have things that we can finally start calling true or false, which is going to be the foundation of logic, propositions. Propositions are the foundation of logic. Sentences are what we use to encode propositions. And so sentences are what we're going to use to encode the foundations of logic, propositions, things that are true or false. Now, simple propositions convey a single fact. Every simple proposition contains a verb and a noun, and compound propositions are composed of multiple simple propositions. So what's an example of a simple proposition? This marker is purple is a simple proposition. This marker is green is a simple proposition. This marker is purple and this marker is green, all that together in one sentence, is a compound proposition. I'm proposing two simple facts. Make sense there? Okay. Now the subject of a proposition. So we've got, for any proposition, it's going to have some term, x, some subject, x, and then something we're saying about x, p. Some proposition about some subject, x. The verb and the noun. For those of you who have done logic, if you think about that as a predicate and the term, so we call that p of x is the way that we symbolize that together, that's exactly what we're talking about here. Okay. X is the subject, P being something that we are saying about that subject, the verb. P of X is how we might put that together. Something said about X, P of X. Some statement where X is the subject. For all our simple statements. So the subject now of a proposition can either be universal or a particular. It can be universal or it can be particular. Our subject. We can be talking about a particular thing or we can be talking about a class of things. Universal or particular. Men are mortal is a universal one. Men being the thing that we're talking about, and are mortal being the verb, what we're stating about the subject. Socrates is mortal is another one. In one case, we were talking about the universal. In another case, we were talking about a particular. Now, notice that it's a little bit weird to say men are mortal. Is that true or false? What are we really saying there? Are we saying all men are mortal or are we saying some men are mortal?
All men.
It's hard to nail down exactly what that statement is saying. It's a little bit weird. So when a proposition is universal, it can have a quantifier associated with it, what we call a universal quantifier or an existential quantifier.
Yep.
Thus, we can say either all men are mortal, applying a universal quantifier, make it talking about universally every one of those. All men are mortal, or we can say some men are mortal. So we're not going to be very interested in men are mortal, propositions like that. He's going to call these like ambiguous propositions or something to that effect. We're going to be interested in the propositions where we say all men are mortal or some men are mortal.
So there is no.
We're not going to be interested in ones where we just say men are mortal.
So you can't just assume that by default you meant all men.
No. Nope, you can't just say, oh, that must be talking about all men, because it didn't specify. Seriously.
So that means nothing then.
No, it means something. It's a predicate. We're saying that things are mortal, but are we saying every of the things are mortal, or some of the things are mortal? We don't have a quantity attached to it, so we need a quantifier. If we're talking about all of them, we call that a universal quantifier. If we're talking about just some of them, that's an existential quantifier. Existential meaning there exists one with the property. Universal meaning all of them have the property.
So if someone said men are mortal, you want to have clarification of what they mean by that specifically?
Yes, when we're talking about logic and you just say men are mortal, we're not positive how to encode that statement.
Interesting.
Okay, when a proposition is universal, oh, we can have either quantifier. Here's the universal one. Here's the existential one. If it lacks a quantifier, the proposition is indefinite. That's what you call it. I don't know what I said before about it. So this is an indefinite proposition. Men are mortal. It's indefinite what exactly that's saying. We haven't nailed it down. It needs a quantifier. It needs to be either saying all men or some men. And notice that in setting up our logic, we're going to be talking about, notice we're always talking about universals and particulars. We're going to be doing the same thing in our logic. Existential quantifiers make us talk about particulars. Universal quantifiers making us talk about universals. So there's going to be a parallel there with how we develop our logic. If it lacks a quantifier, the proposition is indefinite. Thus, we can have universal, particular, and indefinite propositions. Example, all men are mortal, some men are mortal, Plato is mortal, men are mortal. Let's make sense of all four of these real quick. And you'll notice I only list 3 categories there, but I have 4 examples here listed. 2 of these examples are somehow the same. So all men are mortal, that is a universal proposition. Some men are mortal is now a particular proposition. We're saying there is a particular thing, a particular man out there that is mortal. Plato is mortal, is saying there's a particular man out there that's mortal. Furthermore, we're calling that man Plato. So this thing and this thing are somehow saying the same thing. This just adds a little extra more information. This says the same thing as this does with a little bit more information about what that sum is. So these are both particular propositions. This was our only universal proposition so far, all men are mortal. And then finally, men are mortal, we're going to call that an indefinite proposition. So we're not going to be interested in these. We're going to show, I'll show it in a second how these ones like these are really somehow the same as these. And so all we're really interested in are statements like all men are mortal and some men are mortal.
You're saying one goes into many?
This is a particular one. We're saying some particular man is mortal. Some men are mortal.
Yes.
Okay, so this is talking about particulars. This is talking about universals. This is talking about particulars. Somehow it's doing the same thing as this. We'll make that one make more sense here in a second.
Okay.
And then the indefinite is the indefinite. Okay, so push it forward a little bit more. No, we are typically interested in universal and particular propositions composed of universal subjects and quantifiers. So we're interested in universal, ones where the subject is universal, men, not a particular man like Plato, but with a quantifier to make it either universal or particular. So statements like all men are mortal or some men are mortal. Those are the two that we're interested in, statements of that form. Now, going back to this language that we did lecture 1, I told you that we're going to be covering Aristotle's logic. Aristotle's approach to logic is a little bit messier than our current approach to logic. So that first lecture, if you went back and rewatched it, that was going to prime you to be ready to follow how we're going to break this down. Because it's so much easier to understand Aristotle in converting him to modern logic and then just analyzing the modern logic than it is to take Aristotle at face value. That's a pain to do. So even though it's going to feel like a lot of dense notation, I promise you that this is a lot simpler than what he has right now. And so you just got to bite the bullet and wrap your head around the notation. Once you wrap your head around the notation, you got it. So let's try and break down this notation really quick and make sense out of what everything here is saying. So when I have, for all x, some proposition about x, okay, this is saying, this is our universal quantifier, this is a symbol for it. This is saying for all, or for every, or for each, for every x, p of x holds, is true. This is always asserting something true. This is some proposition about x. You can think about p representing the verb that we're applying to x, the subject. X is a subject. So for every subject, p of x is how we're going to encode it. Let's give examples of some of these, how we might break this down. Let's do the all men are mortal. Write the exact same sentence. Well, I'll just write it and then I'll show you what I'm saying. For all men, man is mortal is true, being super explicit to make it make sense with what exactly this is saying. This is saying for every of something, for all of them, for each of them, this thing applies to all of them is true. Some predicate about them is true. So all men are mortal would be encoded this way. All men are mortal is saying for each thing that we call man, it is true that it is mortal. Maybe that's an easier way to say it. Say it is true that. For all x, doesn't matter which one we're talking about it, for all men, it is true that some proposition about that x, p. That's what this is saying. For all x, it is true that some p, some proposition about that x, something we're saying about the x. And so if x is men, and the proposition is mortal, then it's for all men, it is true that men are mortal. So maybe do p of x to make sure that we're saying we're applying x to the proposition there. So if we make x men and p is mortal, for all men, it is true that men is mortal. This notation making sense? Okay, that's the universal notation. We also have the existential quantifier. This is there exists x. And when it goes there exists x, we always say such that when we switch parentheses. and then we make the statement here. So let's write this one out. This says that there exists x such that it is maybe just such that p of x. We don't need, the language reads easier here in English, so we can just write it like that. Such that p of x. There exists a man such that man is mortal. For all men, it is true that men are mortal. There exists x such that there exists a man such that that man is mortal. Making sense here?
Yep.
Okay. Getting a little bit back to his metaphysics, remember what we said. When we're talking about any particular thing, it has form and matter. This is the form of this statement. This is the form of this statement for any statement you write this way. Right?
Okay.
All men are mortal, and all cows are animals, or somehow have the same form.
Yep.
So when we start constructing our arguments, he's going to point out you just have to pay attention to the form of the arguments to determine what is and isn't valid. So it's important to recognize the form of what a statement is saying, the form of some proposition. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's come back down here and hopefully make a little bit more sense. So what are we interested in? We are typically interested in universal and particular propositions composed of a universal subject and quantifiers. So one's like this for when we're talking about particular, one's like this for when we're talking about universal. E.g., for all x, some proposition about x, and there exists x such that some proposition about x. Now note, going back to what we said up here, Plato is mortal. I said somehow that can be encoded somehow the same way as one of these. Well, let's actually encode that whole thing now and make it make sense. Plato is mortal. What is that saying? That is saying that there exists some man such that that man is Plato and that man is mortal.
This is similar to like the every and some functions you would have programming. Like every of this like group, apply this
For each
function.
Yeah.
And then like some is condition, apply this function.
Not on the condition. No.
Like the condition that your name is Plato.
I mean, this thinking underlies everything that happens in programming because all programming comes back to logic. Look, give you a quick view of what bodies of knowledge look like. Okay, foundationally we have what we call propositional logic. Propositional logic, dealing with just propositions. Then we have what we call first order predicate logic, which uses propositional logic. That's what we're developing right now. We're doing both of them in tandem. And then you develop the foundations of math, which is set theory. And then with set theory, you can develop comp theory. And then here you can start talking about programming languages. And you can build your own compilers to have your own language and to start building it out. But it all comes back to propositional logic. All circuits that we ultimately have in a computer, they don't actually, but in theory, you can make them all just start with what we call a Nand Gate. Nand Gate is a simple circuit where the only rule is if I'm not sending a signal down both these, send a signal down this. It doesn't matter what it is, who cares? The point is, this is how it builds up. So it's always using these universal and propositional, these universal and existential quantifiers come in when we're talking about predicate logic. So it's foundational to everything that you do.
I'm just trying to
Using programming
understand is if x is Plato, is it applying the fact that x is Plato, or is it saying that on the condition?
I'm saying that these say the exact same thing. Plato is mortal, says this exact thing. There exists some person, some x, such that x is called Plato, and x is mortal. That's what the statement Plato is mortal means. It means there exists something where this is true.
Yeah, well, I'm confused. It's saying that there exists something that where it not only is mortal, but it's also Plato, and it's not saying that Plato is mortal. Like, it's like saying, it's like you are, wait.
It is saying Plato is mortal.
It's kind of clicking. I'm seeing that.
Okay. When I say Plato is mortal, we're saying that's secretly talking about two things. It's saying, A, there's something out there called Plato, and B, that something out there called Plato is mortal. Both those things are true about that object.
And it's coincidental that it might just be one.
Well, no, it's not coincidental because this has to be about the same thing. When I say Plato is mortal, I'm saying Plato and mortal apply to this thing.
Well then,
So there exists something out there where that thing is a Plato and that thing is a mortal. Both those things apply to that one object when I say Plato is mortal.
so it's almost like you knew the condition before you applied it.
It's like if I were to introduce you to someone who didn't know. I said, Parley is a programmer. I just told all the students in the class, there exists something, namely the thing that you're looking at right now, such that that thing is a Parley and that thing is a programmer. I told you two things about this object I introduced to the class. I told you the name Parley applies, and I told you the name programmer applies. So when we say Plato is mortal, we're saying that thing Plato applies to the object we're talking about, and that thing mortal applies to the object that we're talking about. So there exists some object out there where both these things apply to that object.
Okay.
It's a bit dense to jump into first thing, but
Sounds great.
got to follow Aristotle's development here. Any questions on that?
The something could be many things.
There could be multiple people out there that are Plato and are mortal.
Okay.
But Plato is mortal tells me that there is something out there where this holds. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Bit dense. But now, hopefully, it makes sense to you why a statement like Plato is mortal is really one of these existential quantifier type statements. So, what Aristotle is trying to do here is reduce our language to like the most basic types of statements that we use so that we can talk about just those most basic types of statements. And I don't want to have to talk about statements about a proper noun and statements about some arbitrary instance of a class if I can somehow group those together into one type of statement. If I can somehow reduce statements like this to statements like this, that's way better. Now I only have two types of statements I have to talk about rather than three types of statements. So we're trying to get down to the most simple types of statements that we can talk about because ultimately we're going to be building foundations for how we construct valid arguments. Maybe give you a bit of a jump ahead for where all this is going. I make the statement, give you the typical statement, the typical example. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, what do you conclude? Socrates is mortal. So then you say Socrates is mortal. Now, why is that magically justified? How come these two statements together somehow make this statement true? Is that true for any two statements I put here? Is there some structure these two statements have such that when you put them together, it suddenly makes this other statement true with this particular type of structure?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't want to talk about every possible combination of sentences out there in existence. We want to somehow reduce this to basic principles we can talk about. Notice if I said all men are A, and you have no clue what that is, and then I say Socrates is a, then you can still put that together and conclude, oops, yeah, this is still man, sorry. Then you can still put those together and conclude Socrates is an A from this. And you have no clue what that A is. So it's not knowledge about the particular thing that we're talking about here that somehow makes this true. It's somehow encoded in the structure of this thing that we're using. Knowing that all men are A and Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is an A, that just works for some reason, for any A you put there. Right?
Is this similar to the the mathematical statement that if A equals to B and B equals C, then A equals C.
No, that's just a transitive property of identity. This is better seen with set theory, but really use logic to build set theory. It's backwards to think about the other way, but often useful.
Okay.
Anyways, and notice how we could also replace another thing. If I said all B are A, and Socrates is a B, then Socrates is an A.
Okay.
And he could be the C.
All B are A, Socrates is a B, therefore Socrates is an A. Correct. And I could go one step further. I could say all B are A, C is a B, therefore C is an A. And now any combinations of A's, B's, and C's I pick that make these two true automatically make this third thing true. So this is one of the places that we're headed. We're looking for the ways that we can start constructing valid arguments and how we know when one argument works versus when another argument works.
So basically, you're just starting the foundations of logic.
Yeah, if you want like the basic intuitive definition of logic, logic is the rules for producing true statements from true statements. So if I know that these two statements are true, what other statements can I produce from those two, knowing that? That's what logic is. It's the rules for producing true statements from given true statements.
Yep.
And so he's coming up with the rules for doing that. But first we need to get talking about the statements themselves and what these statements can look like. Statements like this and statements like this. So he's going to go further than what we just did here. He's also going to encode these different types of statements. But to do that, we need to start introducing quantifiers. In fact, let's do it one more just to see it full circle. Following that exact example here, now I can say, for all x, the predicate B applying to x implies the predicate A applies to x. And then I say there exists an x such that C applies to x and B applies to x. And therefore, there exists an x such that C applies to x and A applies to x. So if everything that B applies to, A applies to, and if there exists something that C applies to and B applies to, then there exists something that C applies to and A applies to. That's breaking this down into its irreducible components. This is as broken down as this particular form gets. So this is one form of a valid argument. So let's say it one more time. Notice we're saying that if these two are true, then this is true. So when I read these statements, I'm going to say if, and then this. So if, for all x, B of x being true implies A of x is true. So for all x, if B is the case, then A is the case. And I know that I have a particular x, there exists an x, where C is the case and B is the case. Notice that since B is the case for this particular x, C has to be the case for this particular x. Or sorry, A. B being true for x implies A is true for x. There exists an x such that C of x is true and B of x is true. Therefore, there exists an x such that C of x is true and A of x is true. It's dense, but once you get past the notation, I think that there comes a point where it goes from that's law of notation to get on with your point. So where are we? Still law of notation, or are we saying get on with your point?
Yeah, you're trying to teach us new language.
Yes, it's very dense to begin with. You need to be introduced to these things over and over again, but once you get it, it's just like reading words.
Yep.
Once you know how to read, you look at it and you just read it.
Those middle symbols are
Oh, sorry. See, I use these so much I don't even think about it. It's like when I use the letters, it's like trying to write without using the letter C. Like you're trying to teach some kids and your rule is no using the letter C, they haven't learned that one yet, but you can use all the other letters. Like, that's hard to catch yourself. This means and.
Oh.
And this means implies. Sorry. So we went over that in the beginning. The basic symbols are not, and, or, implies. And I can't help but use these. There's just no way around it.
If we just keep those out, that'd be helpful.
Once you use them a lot, so yeah, it's learning.
Yeah, I think you'll get
English.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Plus, I also read it so much that I read it that way. So, let's read this again. For all x, b of x being true implies a of x is true. There exists an x such that c of x is true and b of x is true. Therefore, there exists an x such that c of x is true and a of x is true.
is there like a specific type of class that teaches
Logic.
only logic? A class called logic?
Yeah, I have a whole playlist on YouTube
Yeah.
called Logic. We did a class on logic. We start with language and we construct logic all the way up to, we're ready for the foundations of set theory. And then if you want to start building set theory, then you can go start my topology playlist, because what I do at the start of that class is construct set theory. But I go back and rebuild logic really quick in just a quick go through. But the thorough going through, yeah, there's a full class, there's textbooks. Yep.
Okay, cool.
Okay, feel like we're getting some of this language. We kind of jumped a lot ahead of what Aristotle's going to cover, so now it's not bad. We can now slowly cover the same stuff and slowly make it all click again. But yeah, seeing this stuff over and over again is great. If you want the really quick version of just running through propositional logic and first order predicate logic, sorry I didn't say it before, I called this predicate logic, it's really called first order predicate logic. Why? Who cares? Just know that you might accidentally hear that name. If it's the first one, that's the one we're talking about. First order predicate logic. But if you go to my topology series, the very first lecture, I do just a blast through of all of these. And so what Aristotle is doing now for much of what's left that we're going to cover in the organon is covering that exact same material, just in a far worse way. So the way I cover it there, it's fast-paced, and it's the proper way to do it, with very precise terms. Don't get confused because we use the same words in a different way. What Aristotle calls the verb, we call the predicate. What Aristotle calls the subject, we call the term. So, and I was probably even saying that here. I can't even help it. It's so hard. For all x, this is a term. B is a predicate about x. It's predicating something to be true of x. Is the way that we typically use the word predicate now in our day-to-day English language. Aristotle uses it different then. But this is the verb about x for Aristotle. This is the verb about x for Aristotle. So everything here, this is terms, this is a predicate together with a term gives you a proposition. That's why we call it propositional logic. It's just taking predicates and combining them with terms to create propositions. And then once you add the quantifiers, then you get to first order predicate logic. Oh, sorry, propositional logic just talks about propositions. That's these things together. Then first order predicate logic, we talk about those as separate things. But anyways, yeah, for very quick run through of all that, you can go watch that first lecture. It would help a lot to cover this material in a very organized way rather than a historical way. Anyways, moving forward. So now, hopefully reading a statement like this now seems pretty simple after everything we read over there. There exists an x such that x is Plato and x is mortal. Makes perfect sense. Plato is mortal. Getting it? Alright, let's throw a lot more examples at you. What do we have here? Affirmations assert a proposition to be true. Denials assert a proposition to be false. Pretty straightforward there, right? Or in other words, when we're talking about denials assert propositions to be false, or they assert the negation to be true. So anytime you deny one proposition, you're actually affirming another proposition. So if you deny the proposition, Donnie is sitting, that is the same as affirming the proposition, Donnie is not sitting. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So every time you deny one affirmation, you're really affirming another affirmation, namely the negation of the initial affirmation. So, does that make sense of it? Example, John is a man, John is not a man. So John is a man, there's an affirmation. The denial of this, calling this false, asserting this proposition is false, is the same thing as asserting this statement as true. John is not a man. So every denial is still asserting some proposition to be true.
Same with the opposite, right?
Yeah, an affirmation is asserting a proposition is true. So calling this true, I'm calling this proposition true. Calling this false, I'm still calling this one true. Point is, you can't get out of it. When you have a proposition and you have its contradiction, one of them has to be true, one of them has to be false. Either A is true or A is not true, meaning not A is true. That might sound weird. Sorry. Let's get down to here and then I think it'll make more sense. So, law of contradiction basically asserts what I'm getting at up here. And we've seen this a bunch of times, but let's see it one more time. Law of contradiction. Contradictory propositions cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time. E.g., the two propositions P is the case and P is not the case are mutually exclusive. One of them has to be true, one of them has to be false. They cannot both be true. That's impossible. They cannot both be false. That's impossible. Another way of summing up the law of contradiction is to say that this is a tautology. So now let's read what this is saying, and we'll break it up nice and slow. So let's look at the inside. P is just some proposition. Give me a proposition. The sky's blue. P is the sky's blue. You with me? So, reading just inside the parentheses for a second here, this says, the sky's blue and the sky's not blue. Is that statement true?
No.
It's false?
Yes.
So it's not true. So it's true that it's not true. And it's always true that it's not true. So it's a tautology. So the tautology, not P and not P. So we're saying this whole thing is always true. Because the inside is always false. It's always false that you have P and not P.
Yep.
This is like building foundation of mathematics. It's kind of
Lower. Building logic.
cool. Yeah.
Logic is mathematics is constructed from logic. Now, you might remember, clear back to our first class, we talked about a distribution rule for negation. You can distribute not over a conjunction, and it produces a disjunction. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Let's just write it out. Not P and not P is the same thing as, logically equivalent to, when we distribute the not, it turns ands into ors. So this is the same thing as not P and not P. And then not P is the same thing as,
Got that
oh
wrong.
thank you, or. And then not P is the same thing as just P.
So
If it's not the case, then it is a case. So this is not P or P. So that says the same thing. Not P and not P is the same thing as not P or P. It's easier for us to see how this is always true. Imagine you're taking an algebra test, and the teacher says, solve for x. And you say x is equal to 6 or it's not equal to 6. That's right. That's true. It's always the case that it's either P or not P. What's the answer? It's either 6 or not 6. Yep. So this is always true. It's logically equivalent to not P and not P.
So, you're saying that or is the contradiction of and.
No. Contradiction. Contradiction is a type of statement. This is a contradiction. P and not P. P and not P. Here's a statement. Here's its negation. The conjunction of a statement with its negation is a contradiction. Now, sometimes we use loose language and we say not P is a contradiction of P, and P is a contradiction of not P.
Okay,
We
so
should really say negation.
What's the
but
proper word?
they're in no sense opposed to each other.
Affirmation then?
No. Here's the best intuition for it. and with logic acts a lot like multiplication on numbers, and or with logic acts a lot like addition with numbers. Furthermore, true in logic acts a lot like 1 with numbers, and false in logic acts a lot like 0 in numbers.
Yeah, I've had to work with that.
So
they're
this
not-
is called a Boolean algebra.
So they're not like on the same field at all.
I don't know how to answer that.
Well, sorry, I realize that. I'm just, you being able to carry in the not and making the and into a not, does that always work?
Yes, yes. It is always the case that this and this are the same.
But I'm saying if you apply the not to all of the components and it switches the and into an or. That relation is interesting.
I don't know what you mean by all the components. But yes, this is identical to this.
Yes.
Is identical to this.
I totally understand that.
If you do a truth table for all these, you always get the same values.
But under more complex situations, if you were to apply a not to all of the terms.
Oh, you're saying if we apply a not and I'm anding together like 8 terms in here?
Yeah, which the alternate ors.
Okay, so you don't have to even worry about whether or not you can do that because that's not allowed technically. Technically, you always have to be dealing with 2 terms at a time. So you're saying it would be not P and, then you'd have to have parentheses Q and R if we had 3 of them here. You can't just put a bunch listed together in parentheses. Technically, you're breaking the rules.
That's true. Because
You have to
can
always do
apply
2 at
one
a time. So yes, I could do the not and distribute it over this, and then once again I could do the not and distribute it over those.
And those would alternate ors.
Well, it might not come out exactly how you expect. When I do the not here, we get not P or not Q and R.
Okay.
Oh, yep, it's going to come out exactly how you expect. Not P or not Q or not R.
So it's almost like they're the positive and the negative of the math almost.
Negation, the not acts.
What if I was to apply a not to an
Like
and
a
or?
negative.
Would it turn back into an and?
If you apply a not to an or, does it turn back? Yes, it goes both ways.
Wow. So interesting.
So yeah, if we say, because this already makes intuitive sense to you. If I say not A and B, that's identical to saying not A or not B. So A is I'm holding a purple marker, green, blue. B is I'm holding a green marker. And I say it's not the case that I'm holding a red marker, I'm holding a purple marker, and I'm holding a green marker. It's not the case. It's the same thing as I'm not holding a purple marker or I'm not holding a green marker. They'll say the exact same thing.
That's incredible.
But what if you do it not holding the purple marker or not holding the green marker?
So if we switch this to an or, then we have to switch this to an and. I am so broken today. And now this and this say the exact same thing. If I'm not holding a purple or a green, then either I'm not, if I'm not holding a purple or a green, then I'm not holding purple and I'm not holding a green.
Okay.
This is so cool because all the times in programming I run into very complex conditions and or statements. And oftentimes it gets so overwhelming you can't even keep it on your head. And if I was able to put it into more of an algebraic format.
Yes, there's
and
something called
simplify it.
Boolean Algebra, and you can do algebra with Booleans the same way you do algebra with numbers, except for it's a billion times easier because there's only 2 values.
Yeah.
True and false. It's like, let's do arithmetic, but our only numbers are 1 and 0.
That's so cool. That's going to literally make my job so much easier.
Well, who says philosophy doesn't apply in real life?
Yeah.
Doesn't have real world applications. Okay. Anyways, a lot of logic there. Again, strongly recommend watching the beginning of the topology series if you want to get a quick blast through of all these. It'll be dense, it'll be fast, but we'll cover everything that we're going to cover in here. And it'll be nice and structured. Okay. talked about the law of contradiction. We explained how this is a tautology, right? It's always true. That makes sense now. Is there anyone so confused by this? We could do a truth table really quick if this isn't crystal clear.
Makes sense.
Crystal clear? Okay. So, law of contradiction is saying that two contradictory statements can't both be true. It's always the case that two contradictory statements can't both be true. Now, you have to be talking about contradictory statements or negations of each other. You have to be talking about the negation. You can't be talking about contrary statements. This is about contradictory statements, not contrary statements. It is possible for this to happen with contrary statements. Right?
Yep.
Okay, so let's get contradiction here. Let's explain contradiction, contrary, and subcontrary, and then we'll end it there. So, contradicting statements. The contradiction of all swans are white is what? Not you.
I know.
Okay. What's the contradiction of all swans are white?
All swans are not white?
Is that the contradiction? Can we live in a world where both those statements are false?
Some swans are not white.
Some swans are not white. So either all swans are white or some swans are not white. These two statements are contradictory statements. One of them has to be true, one of them has to be false. To say that, if I say all swans are white, and you say that's false, if you deny this statement, what are you asserting? You are asserting some swans are not white.
Yeah.
And if I deny this statement, if you say some swans are not white, and I say that's not true, I'm asserting that all swans are white. Make sense? That's what we mean with negation. Negation is always talking about the contradiction of a statement.
That's cool.
Okay, let's look at contrary statements now. Contrary statements. All swans are white, no swans are white. Notice that we could live in a world where half the swans are white and half the swans are not white. Half white, half black. That could be our universe. Then which of those is true? Neither. They're both false. So we could live in a universe where this one's true and this one's false. We could live in a universe where this one's true and this one's false. But we could also live in a universe where both of these are false. Contrary. It is impossible for us to live in a universe where both these are false. One of these, no matter what universe we live in, will always be true, and one of them will always be false. So, contradictory, one's for sure true, one's for sure false. Contrary, they can't both be true. Now, the last one Aristotle introduces is subcontrary. Subcontrary is they can't both be false. So one of these has to be true. But they can both be true. So some swans are white, some swans are not white. I could live in a universe where half my swans are white. Then they're both true. But notice that they can't both be false. No matter what universe we live in, either some of the swans are white or some of the swans are not white. So they can both be true, but they can't both be false. So, can't both be false, can't both be true. One's for sure true, one's for sure false. Contradictory, contrary, subcontrary. Good? It's a lot to take in, getting the foundations of logic, getting this language down, but we're getting there. And once we get the language down, I think the rest will come for free. It'll take us a bit to get the language down, but then prior analytics, we'll get through like that once we get the language down. Any questions on any of this? We'll end it there. So.
Could you write down the possible booleans for each those last three statements?
The possible booleans?
Yeah.
So our cases here is we could have true, false, or we could have false, true, and those are the only possible cases for the top one.
Okay. And the next one?
For this one, we could have false, false, we could have true, false, we could have false, true. And then for this one, we can have true, true. We can have true, false. We can have false, true. So maybe rewrite this one more time. So for the top one, we can have true, false, or we can have false, true. So notice that all of them include these two cases. This one adds one more case. This one adds one more case. So the only case this one's missing is they can't both be false. The only case this one's missing is they can't both be true. The only case the top one's missing, well, the top one's missing two cases.
Because it adds the sum of all, or
I wrote these on word lines, didn't I? Let me write it underneath. So this one could have, let me write them all underneath. So this one, we could have true, false, or we can have false, true. This one we can have false, false, true, false, false, true, and then true, false. B, or C's are in the same order. Oh, I changed the order there. Jeez. I think you get it. I don't need it.
yeah.
So notice that with any two propositions, there's four cases. You can have true, true, false, true, true, false, false, false. Those are the four possible cases for any two propositions.
Right.
If we're saying two propositions are contradictory, we're guaranteeing it's always this case. If we're saying that they're contrary, we're guaranteeing that's one of these three cases. If we're saying that it's subcontrary, we're guaranteeing that's one of these three cases. And again, that's just based off of the structure of the statement. It has nothing to do with what the statement actually says. It's all encoded in the structure. So we'll get to how these ones are encoding the structure, because it might seem weird that this and this are somehow the negation of each other, like those words don't overlap at all. So we'll get to that one next time. But
Well, because some of them are white, you can't possibly have all of them white.
right, but I'm saying the algebra for it. Here's the algebra for it.
Gotcha.
If you're saying not for all x, some proposition about x, that is the same thing as when you distribute a negative over a universal quantifier, it turns into an existential quantifier. So that's the same thing as there exists x such that not p of x. So it is not the case that for all swans they are white, says the same thing as there exists a swan that is not white.
Wow. That's awesome.
So that's why this all turns into a sum when we negate it. Not all swans are white. If we take the negation of this, not all swans are white is the same thing as some swans are not white. So that's how the algebra works on that. Anything else? Okay.
I think we're good.
We'll continue with it next week. Hopefully. I might have to cancel on you. I don't know yet.